Now there's the big main brands you get in hi-fi, things like Sennheiser, Odyssey, Hyphaman, Focal, and many more. But then there's ones that you may not know about until you're deeper in the niche, things like Modhouse Audio, one that has become famous for its old modded headphones, the Argon, but now have made a planar of their own from the ground up. Let's talk about it. This is Tungsten, a planar magnetic headphone that is being made from the ground up by a guy in Pennsylvania using his own custom planar driver, multi-jet fusion nylon for the chassis components, spring steel, Alcantara, ZMF pads, and more. These are definitely something different. Actually, on the back side of this grill right here, the same pattern is duplicated but is cut out in wood for its acoustic properties. It's kind of cool. These are also, as you can see, completely modular. You could take them apart, put them back together, do whatever you needed to, change out parts, and so on. It's kind of nice if something were to break, he could just send you a part instead of having to replace the headphone. The cable comes from Viking Weave Cables, a guy named Skedra who's in the community. If you're deep in audio, you've probably heard of him before. He makes really, really high quality, nice feeling stuff, and I'm really glad to see his cables are being used for tungsten. It's dual entry 3.5, which isn't uncommon, but they are seated in here in this nice little groove, so it acts like a strain relief. These are adjustable up and down. There is a little bit of padding inside this leather on the top, and the ear cups are nice and big. Now once I got these to the height that I like for my head, I just ended up locking these adjusters on the side, just right where it fits me, and it's nice and comfortable. Now, these are not super light. It's definitely not as heavy as some ZMFs, it's definitely not as heavy as some Odysseys, but it's also not as light as a lot of Hyphamans. So they do have a bit of heft to them. Luckily, that weight is very well distributed across the board. They feel pretty comfortable. There are times where I would like a little more padding on top, and so what I've done is I just push this in a little bit more and give them a touch more clamp. Overall, I think they look really cool. These are metal backs, by the way. I should note this is a custom color that he did for me. They're available in multiple colors, but he painted the metal yellow and did a black chassis to match my channel colors. I would say the weakest point of the build as a whole is probably the adjustment mechanism, but that's generally the case with a lot of headphones. The pads do magnetically attach and detach, though it's just a normal Caldera pad adhered onto this metal ring. So realistically, you could put a different one on if you wanted to. And the way these fit on, they do kind of lock in one orientation, but if you were to twist them a little bit, the magnets still hold them on, and it creates a bit of an air gap underneath them. We'll talk about what that does later in sound, but it's actually pretty cool. Overall, the build is pretty solid. You can tell that these aren't being pumped out of a factory and that someone is assembling them by hand, but it's also not a generic headphone design. It's pretty unique, uses a lot of cool shapes, neat patterns that I like quite a bit. And I think as long as you take care of it, it would last just fine. Though that said, Modhouse also has a pretty great reputation for customer support. The guy who's building these, Ryan, has been in the community for a really long time. You go to pretty much any Can Jam New York City and you'll see him there. And he's been working on these for years and years and years, bringing prototypes to shows, asking people to listen to them, and giving feedback. Let's talk about how they sound, we'll do measurements, and then we'll do a conclusion. Right off the bat, I'm going to say something controversial, and that's that these are better than any Hyphaman, at least in terms of sound. There are some things that Hyphaman does better, but for me, it doesn't quite balance out. So things like the Aria, I get more soundstage out of, the same thing with the Edition XS, but in every other conceivable facet, these sound better than any Hyphaman to me. It's like if you took the original HE6 and modernized it in every single way. Gave it a good frequency response, made it sound really detailed, smoothed out all the weird parts of it, but kept that sort of aggressive planar power, that sort of punch and that sort of impact that made HE6 what it is, and also retaining the other fun thing that HE6 had back then, which was being really hard to drive. These take a lot of juice. If you have something like a topping A90, you're going to have to run it on high gain. It definitely gets to listenable volume levels as long as your DAC is pumping out enough juice for it. In fact, I listen to them on things like a Dark Voice sometimes, and that still has plenty of power, but not to get to like blistering loud volume levels. It just depends on how loud you listen. Me being a person who listens in the mid-70s, something like the Dark Voice is fine. The A90 gets much louder than I personally listen to the headphone, but there is also a community of people who are all buying these and using them with things like speaker amps, speaker taps. Golden Sound made a PSA about that, but you pretty much don't usually want to run a high impedance load on a Class D amp, unless it is designed to take that high impedance load. This can result actually in lots of noise above the audible threshold in like super high frequencies that could still potentially be damaging. Be careful and monitor what sources you're going to be plugging these into if you're plugging them into speaker amps. For me, something like an A90 is more than enough, though something like an Atom does not quite power them. You're pretty much entirely going to be using these on a balanced connection like this, because pretty much every amp that's going to be strong enough to drive them is going to be using a balanced connection. But at those levels, what you get is something incredible. Again, for me being someone who listens in like the mid 70 dB range, vocals are very delicate. They're very, very present. You can hear every little bit that comes off of a microphone, but it's not sibilant. It's not bright. It does have air to it, but not in a way that sounds overly present or overly airy. The timbre of these is really good. So you kind of get timbre, which, if you don't know, timbre is kind of the metric of how natural something sounds. You get the timbre out of these that is much more like a dynamic driver headphone. And tungsten ends up being a great middle ground between the sort of fast, impactful, and super detailed sounding nature of a planar driver with the good timbre and vocal presence of a dynamic driver, all in one, which is super cool. What you also get is good bass presence in a way that has a slight amount of warmth to it, but if you do this, you get a bass shelf in very, very low frequencies, which we'll talk about later in measurements. But it's not like a 100 hertz bump or anything like that. It's actually in the sub bass. And because of that, the bass in these is very enveloping. It's very subwoofer-like. Rather than when you have a bass shelf on a headphone and it just sounds like the bass is heavy and impactful, which this still does, it's a bit more like the bass is roomy and airy and spacious. It's sub bass that sounds more enveloping than the size of the headphone. And it's definitely not as high in level as some things that are like a closed back dynamic, but for an open back headphone, especially an open back planar, it is really surprising the amount of bass that I get out of this, and especially the fact that it's clean and enveloping bass. So things like Lorne are super, super fun. The staging in that, while not as wide as something like an Aria, is more realistic to me than something like an Aria is. Vocals are pretty close in, but it depends on how they're recorded. Binaural recordings are, well, about like they are in the room. Whereas a microphone like this, it generally sounds like a microphone at this distance. Very truthful sounding, not over exaggerated. And you take all these factors across the board, what you put them together and get is that tungsten is actually a truly high fidelity, using the actual term here, headphone. It is a headphone that is pretty truthful to the source. There are some areas where it's got some flavor added. Again, it has a little bit of warmth and there's a little bit less ear gain than you might be used to in the middle of the ear gain in some headphones, but it's very truthful still. Now, before we do measurements, if you want to support the channel, if you want some exclusive content, you can check me out over on Floatplane. I've got a video there on setting up a music streaming server at home. It specifically is going to Jose. Nothing like a nice, sharp object just being loose in the case. Who needs Spotify or Tidal or anything like that when you can just host it yourself?
Mildly concerning.
That's on Floatplane, along with a lot of other exclusive fun content, shenanigans here on The Office, and so on. You can check that out, the link in the video description. Let's get into measurements. I've got a measurement pulled up here of the tungsten on my Brüel & Kjær 4128, and you can see it's pretty dang linear across the board. We get decent bass extension, a little bit of warmth there in the low mids. As it goes throughout the mid-range, I like that unlike a lot of headphones, it doesn't bump up right there at 1K because that can result in shout in some things. We get that similar sort of 1500 to 2 kilohertz dip that you get in a lot of Hyphaman stuff. Comes back up near the average listener preference around 3K, and then we elevate a little bit from there. Now, somewhere in that 8 to 10 kilohertz range is the coupler making a peak there. But outside of that, there is definitely a little bit of treble elevation in that region, so it's not just the measurement rig doing that. And I think that contributes a little bit to the airy sound of it. This doesn't bother me, especially not when I'm listening at my normal levels, like in the mid 70s. If I turn it up past that, if I get into like the mid to upper 80s, then that treble starts to become a little bit more spicy to me. Kind of a similar effect to what I got on the Empyrean 2. But overall, you end up with a pretty balanced, slightly warm-leaning headphone. And if you twist those pads to give it an air gap, now this is showing a different measurement. This is Resolve's unit off the Brüel & Kjær 5128. Look at that bass bump you get down in the low end. That is from the air gap, which is pretty cool. He also has a set of like hybrid suede pads that make it a little bit warmer and also recess a bit more around 1 kilohertz. Something I forgot to mention, actually you can get rid of that treble peak by taking these backs off, but then it starts to get a little bit dark. I did make some 3D printed grills for these that sit right in the middle, but Honestly, at the level I listen at, I do prefer the stock grills on here. But if I ever want to listen a little bit louder, then I prefer the 3D printed grills that are just a little bit more open and bring that treble area down just a hair. Now, Tungsten is not a perfect headphone, as I'm sure you've noticed, but what it is a really, really good one. I've taken my time reviewing this. I've really wanted to see how the community's reacted to it as well. And this has basically gained a cult following. There are Discord channels and Telegram chats dedicated just to people who are buying and listening to these, trying them in all different types of sources, all the different songs they listen to on them. It's a headphone that is very well received by the community. And it's absolutely the outcome of someone who's extremely enthusiastic about audio, extremely enthusiastic about the community they're a part of, making their own passion project into a reality, and that is a flagship headphone with true flagship performance. Now, I know I talk all the time about how price and sound quality don't correlate, and that there's things that sound great at all price points, but Tungsten, compared to its competitors, especially at this price point, it is very fairly priced. I feel like it exceeds the performance of a lot of things that are priced way higher, even things that a lot of people consider really good. Like I would take this over Sysavara any day of the week. I would take this over Aria Organic. In fact, in some cases, I would also take this over the Empyrean 2. It just depends on what you're into. This is definitely a lot more linear and more truthful than Empyrean 2 is, whereas Empyrean 2 is a little bit more on the fun-leaning side. I would take it over basically anything that Fostex has ever made. I would probably also take this over the new Utopia. I would take it over the LCD5. I would take it over pretty much any of the stacks. It is just a truly excellent headphone. Again, with some drawbacks, but it's up for you to decide if those matter for you or not. For me personally, this is something that stays really close by. I listen to it very frequently. It's probably in my, I'd say, top 3 things in my collection. And whenever I want to really wow someone with a headphone, this is one of the ones I put on their head. I also think this headphone is an excellent representation of the passion of the audio community that's resulted in a product in real life. So with all that said, if sound is your primary priority, I highly recommend the Modhouse Tungsten. And I think it's time to wrap this video up. So if you liked it, leave a like down below. A comment letting me know what you want to see in the future. If you want to get active in the community, get the Discord or the forum, both available at the link in the video description. As always, don't forget to stick around and subscribe for more videos like this in the future. Until next one, guys. Peace.